Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had always been the quiet one in Alpha Squad. While her teammates joked and shared stories during their downtime at the remote military outpost in Afghanistan, she preferred cleaning her rifle or studying terrain maps. Her fellow soldiers respected her skills but never imagined she would become their salvation. The morning of September 15th started like any other. The sun rose over the Rocky Mountains surrounding their base, casting long shadows across the compound. Maria was assigned to the watchtower with her spotter, Corporal Jake Thompson. They had been monitoring the valley below for 3 hours when Jake noticed something unusual. A convoy of vehicles was approaching from the east, moving slower than normal supply trucks. Through her scope, Maria could see the lead vehicle had damage to its front bumper. Something felt wrong. She radioed down to Sergeant First Class David Kim, who was coordinating with the other squads. The base housed 42 soldiers from different units, all working together to secure this strategic mountain pass. Maria knew each face, each voice over the radio. Private First Class Sarah Chen was in the communications bunker. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison was reviewing intelligence reports in the command center. These people were her family. As the convoy drew closer, Maria's unease grew stronger. The vehicles were moving in a formation she had never seen before. Her training kicked in as she adjusted her rifle scope and studied each truck carefully. The second vehicle had tinted windows, which was unusual for military transports in this region. Jake was using binoculars to scan the surrounding hills. Military protocol required them to watch for coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The valley had been quiet for weeks, but recent intelligence reports suggested increased enemy activity in neighboring areas. Maria's radio crackled to life. Command was trying to verify the convoy's identification codes. The response from the lead vehicle was garbled and unclear. Standard procedure required the convoy to stop at the checkpoint, but they continued moving toward the base entrance. The first sign of real trouble came when Maria spotted movement in the hills to the north. Through her scope, she could see figures positioning themselves behind rocks and trees. They were too far away to identify clearly, but their movements suggested hostile intent. She immediately reported the potential threat to command while keeping her rifle trained on the suspicious figures. Jake continued monitoring the convoy, which was now only 500 meters from the base entrance. The situation was escalating rapidly. Command ordered all personnel to defensive positions. Maria could hear boots running across the compound below as soldiers moved to their assigned locations. The communications bunker went into lockdown mode. Guards at the main gate prepared to stop the approaching convoy. The convoy suddenly accelerated toward the main entrance. Maria could see the gate guards scrambling to close the barriers, but the lead vehicle was moving too fast. Her finger moved to her rifle's trigger as she prepared for the worst possible scenario. In the hills to the north, more figures became visible. Maria counted at least 15 potential hostiles moving into attack positions. The coordination between the convoy and the hill positions confirmed her worst fears. This was a planned assault on their base. The lead vehicle crashed through the partially closed gate, sending metal fragments flying in all directions. Maria watched helplessly as guards dove for cover. The truck continued racing toward the main buildings where most of her squad was positioned. Through her scope, Maria could see something attached to the truck's undercarriage. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The vehicle was loaded with explosives. This was not just an attack but a suicide bombing designed to destroy their entire base. She screamed warnings over the radio, but there was no time for anyone to reach safe distances. The truck was heading directly toward the barracks where 12 of her squad members were taking cover. Maria knew she had seconds to act, but her position in the watchtower left her too far away to make any difference. The second vehicle in the convoy had stopped just inside the gate, and armed fighters were pouring out. Maria could see muzzle flashes as they began firing at any soldier in sight. The attack was unfolding exactly as the enemy had planned. Jake grabbed her shoulder and pointed toward the emergency escape route from their tower. Military protocol demanded they evacuate to a safer position during a ground assault, but Maria could not abandon her vantage point when her squad needed covering fire. The truck loaded with explosives was now 50 meters from the barracks. Maria watched her teammates running in different directions trying to find cover. Some were returning fire at the attacking fighters, while others were helping wounded comrades reach safety. She made a split-second decision that would change everything. Instead of following evacuation procedures, Maria adjusted her rifle scope and took aim at the truck's driver. If she could stop the vehicle before it reached the main buildings, she might save dozens of lives. The distance was challenging, but within her capabilities. Maria controlled her breathing and squeezed the trigger just as the world around her exploded into chaos and flames. The explosion came from behind Maria, not from the truck she was targeting. A massive blast ripped through the watchtower's base, sending concrete and metal flying in all directions. The force of the detonation threw her against the tower's protective barrier as the entire structure began to collapse. Jake disappeared in the initial blast. Maria felt the tower tilting as its support beams gave way. She managed to grab her rifle before the platform completely collapsed, but there was no time to help her spotter. The watchtower crashed down with tremendous force, burying everything beneath tons of twisted metal and concrete. Maria found herself trapped under a heavy steel beam, her left leg pinned and bleeding. Dust and smoke filled the air, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Her ears were ringing from the blast, and she could taste blood in her mouth. The silence was more terrifying than the explosion had been. She tried to move the beam but quickly realized it was too heavy. Pain shot through her leg with every attempt to free herself. Maria forced herself to stay calm and assess her situation. Her rifle was within reach and she still had ammunition. More importantly, she was alive when she should have been dead. The smoke began to clear, revealing the devastation around her. The watchtower was completely destroyed, and she could see bodies scattered across the compound below. The truck loaded with explosives had detonated near the communications bunker, creating a crater where the building once stood. Maria realized that a second explosive device had been planted at the base of her watchtower. The enemy had planned to eliminate the overwatch position first, preventing any coordinated defense of the base. She had survived only because the steel beam had created a small protective space when the tower collapsed. Through gaps in the wreckage, she could see enemy fighters moving through the compound. They were checking bodies and securing different areas of the base. Maria counted at least 20 attackers, all heavily armed and moving with military precision. This was not a random assault, but a carefully planned operation. Her radio was damaged but still functional. Maria tried to contact any surviving members of her unit, keeping her voice low to avoid detection. Static filled the airwaves with only occasional fragments of desperate transmissions coming through. Someone was calling for medical assistance, but she could not identify the voice. The beam trapping her leg was positioned at an angle that gave her a clear view of the main compound. Maria could see 3 of her squad members taking cover behind an overturned vehicle. They were pinned down by enemy fire and running low on ammunition, based on their reduced rate of return fire. Enemy fighters were advancing on their position from 2 directions. Maria realized her teammates would be overrun within minutes unless someone provided covering fire from an elevated position. Her current location in the collapsed watchtower actually gave her an excellent shooting angle. She carefully positioned her rifle through a gap in the wreckage, taking care not to expose herself to enemy observation. The distance to the nearest attacker was approximately 400 meters, well within her effective range. Maria had trained for situations exactly like this, but she had never fired with a crushed leg and possible internal injuries. The first shot took down an enemy fighter who was flanking her trapped squad members. The sound of her rifle echoed across the compound, immediately drawing attention to her position. Several attackers began moving toward the collapsed watchtower, forcing Maria to relocate within the wreckage. She managed to crawl a few feet to a new position, dragging her injured leg behind her. The movement caused tremendous pain, but it also gave her a better angle to protect her teammates. Maria took down 2 more attackers before they could reach the overturned vehicle where her squad was hiding. Enemy fighters began firing at the collapsed watchtower, but they could not pinpoint her exact location within the debris. Maria used this confusion to continue providing covering fire, while her squad members repositioned to a more defensible location. She watched them successfully reach the armory building, where they would have access to heavier weapons. The radio crackled with a weak transmission from Sergeant Kim. He was coordinating survivors from a position near the motor pool. Maria learned that at least 15 soldiers had survived the initial attack, but they were scattered across the compound and unable to regroup due to enemy fire. Maria realized she was in a unique position to assist the scattered survivors. Her elevated location in the collapsed watchtower gave her visibility across most of the compound. She could see enemy positions that were hidden from soldiers at ground level. More importantly, she could provide overwatch protection while survivors moved to rally points. Over the next hour, Maria systematically targeted enemy fighters who threatened surviving soldiers. She helped cover the movement of 3 separate groups as they converged on the armory building. Each shot had to be precise because her ammunition was limited, and her position would be compromised if she missed. The enemy began to realize that an effective sniper was operating from the destroyed watchtower. They started dedicating resources to locating and eliminating her position. Maria knew it was only a matter of time before they organized a coordinated assault on her location. She used her radio to contact Sergeant Kim and provide intelligence about enemy positions and movements. The information allowed the regrouped survivors to plan a counterattack that would drive the remaining attackers away from the compound. But first, they needed to eliminate the enemy's heavy weapons position. Through her scope, Maria identified a machine gun nest that the enemy had established near the main gate. The position was preventing any survivors from reaching the communications equipment needed to call for reinforcements. The machine gun was positioned approximately 800 meters from her location. The shot would be challenging under normal circumstances, but Maria was dealing with injury, limited ammunition, and an unstable shooting platform. She had one opportunity to eliminate the machine gun position before the enemy located her hiding spot within the wreckage. Maria controlled her breathing and calculated the range, wind speed, and elevation factors. Her injured leg was throbbing with pain, but she forced herself to focus on the shot. The lives of every surviving soldier depended on her ability to make this one crucial shot from an impossible position. Maria steadied her rifle against a piece of twisted metal from the collapsed watchtower. The machine gun position was heavily fortified with sandbags and steel plates, making it nearly impossible to hit the gunner directly. She needed to find a weakness in their defensive setup that would neutralize the entire position with a single shot. Through her scope, she studied the enemy position carefully. The machine gun was belt-fed with ammunition boxes stacked nearby. More importantly, she noticed several green containers that looked like fuel cans positioned behind the gunner's location. If she could hit one of those containers, the resulting explosion might eliminate the entire machine gun nest. The distance was greater than any shot she had attempted in combat conditions. Maria had made similar shots during training exercises, but never while injured and trapped under debris. Her shooting position was unstable, and she could not use her normal prone stance for maximum accuracy. She radioed Sergeant Kim to coordinate the timing of her shot with the planned counterattack. The surviving soldiers would advance from the armory building as soon as she eliminated the machine gun position. If she missed, her squad would be running directly into the line of fire from a position they could not assault. Maria checked her ammunition count. She had only 3 rounds remaining in her current magazine, with 1 additional magazine available. Every shot needed to count because there would be no opportunity to reacquire targets if the enemy located her position and mounted an assault on the collapsed watchtower. The wind was variable, shifting between calm periods and strong gusts that would affect bullet trajectory over such a long distance. Maria waited for a lull in the wind conditions while keeping her crosshairs aligned with the fuel containers behind the machine gun position. The shot had to be perfect. Enemy fighters were still searching through the compound, checking buildings and eliminating any wounded soldiers they discovered. Maria watched helplessly as they executed 2 injured soldiers who had been hiding in the motor pool. The brutality reinforced her determination to help the survivors escape this nightmare. Through her radio, she could hear Sergeant Kim organizing the survivors for their desperate counterattack. They had recovered additional weapons and ammunition from the armory, but they were still outnumbered by at least 2 to 1. Success depended entirely on eliminating the machine gun that controlled the main approaches to the compound. Maria took a deep breath and focused on the shot. The fuel container was a relatively small target at 800 meters, especially considering the angle from her elevated position in the wreckage. She had to account for bullet drop, wind drift, and the fact that her rifle scope had been damaged in the explosion. The crosshairs settled on the target as the wind calmed. Maria squeezed the trigger with steady pressure, following through with her shot even as the rifle recoiled against her shoulder. The bullet traveled for what seemed like an eternity before striking the fuel container. The explosion was immediate and devastating. Flames erupted from the machine gun position as the fuel ignited, spreading to ammunition boxes and other explosive materials. The enemy gunner and his assistant were killed instantly, while several other fighters nearby were wounded by flying debris and burning fuel. Sergeant Kim's voice crackled over the radio with confirmation that the machine gun was destroyed. The survivors immediately began their counterattack, moving from building to clear out the remaining enemy fighters. Maria provided overwatch support, identifying targets and directing the advance through radio communications. The counterattack was swift and decisive. Without their heavy weapons position, the enemy fighters were unable to maintain control of the compound. Several attackers attempted to retreat toward the main gate, but Maria was able to eliminate 3 of them before they reached cover outside the perimeter. Within 30 minutes, the compound was secure. The surviving soldiers had eliminated or driven off all enemy fighters, though at a terrible cost. Maria learned through radio reports that 28 soldiers had been killed in the initial attack, with 8 others wounded but alive. Only 14 soldiers remained combat effective. Sergeant Kim led a search and rescue team to the collapsed watchtower where Maria was trapped. It took 4 soldiers working together to lift the steel beam and free her crushed leg. She had lost a significant amount of blood and was barely conscious when they finally pulled her from the wreckage. The medic, Specialist Rodriguez, immediately began treating Maria's injuries. Her left leg was severely damaged with possible fractures and extensive soft tissue damage. She also had a concussion and several deep cuts from flying debris. The medic was amazed she had remained conscious and functional for so long. While receiving medical treatment, Maria learned the full scope of the enemy attack. Intelligence reports suggested this had been a coordinated assault by a large terrorist cell that had been planning the operation for months. They had somehow obtained detailed information about the base layout and defensive positions. The attack on the watchtower had been specifically designed to eliminate overwatch capabilities and prevent coordinated defense. Maria's survival and continued resistance had disrupted their entire battle plan. Her accurate shooting had prevented the complete destruction of the base and the massacre of all personnel. Sergeant Kim organized the surviving soldiers to establish a defensive perimeter while they waited for evacuation helicopters. The communications equipment had been destroyed, but they managed to jury-rig a radio system using parts from damaged equipment. Help was finally on the way. Medical helicopters arrived 2 hours later, along with a quick reaction force to secure the area. Maria was among the first to be evacuated due to the severity of her injuries. As the helicopter lifted off, she could see the devastation below and the bodies of soldiers who had not been as fortunate as she was. During the flight to the field hospital, Maria reflected on the events of the day. She had survived an explosion that should have killed her, then managed to provide crucial support to her fellow soldiers despite being trapped and injured. The experience had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The medical team at the field hospital worked for hours to save her leg and treat her other injuries. Maria drifted in and out of consciousness, but she could hear doctors discussing her condition and the remarkable circumstances of her survival. They called her case extraordinary, though she felt anything but heroic. Recovery would take months, but Maria was alive when 31 of her fellow soldiers were not. She carried the weight of their sacrifice along with the knowledge that her actions had prevented an even greater tragedy. The real test of her courage was yet to come. 3 weeks after the attack, Maria lay in a hospital bed in Germany, staring at the metal framework holding her leg together. Doctors had managed to save the limb, but her military career was effectively over. The physical therapy would take months, and even then, she would never regain full mobility. The woman who had once been her unit's best marksman could barely walk to the bathroom without assistance. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes visited Maria every few days to update her on the investigation into the attack. Intelligence agencies had traced the terrorist cell responsible and were working to prevent similar operations. More importantly for Maria, she learned that all 14 surviving soldiers from her base had fully recovered from their injuries. The psychological impact was harder to measure than the physical damage. Maria experienced nightmares about the explosion and the faces of soldiers who had not survived. She could still hear Jake's voice from their final conversation in the watchtower, moments before he disappeared in the blast. Survivor's guilt weighed on her more heavily than the steel framework on her leg. Military psychologists visited regularly to help Maria process the trauma. Dr. Jennifer Walsh was patient and understanding, but Maria struggled to articulate her feelings about that day. She felt responsible for the soldiers who had died, even though everyone told her she had saved lives. The logic did not diminish the emotional burden she carried. News media had learned about Maria's actions during the attack. Reporters wanted to interview the soldier who had single-handedly turned the tide of battle while trapped under debris. Military public affairs officers protected her from most media requests, but Maria knew her story was being told whether she participated or not. The preliminary report on her actions during the attack was extraordinary. Military analysts calculated that her accurate shooting had eliminated 11 enemy fighters and prevented the complete destruction of the base. Her 800-meter shot that destroyed the machine gun position was being studied as an example of exceptional marksmanship under impossible conditions. Maria received visits from family members who traveled from across the United States to see her. Her parents, Roberto and Carmen Rodriguez, had been told she was critically injured, but not the full details of her heroic actions. When they learned what she had accomplished, their pride was mixed with horror at how close they had come to losing their daughter. Her younger brother, Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez, was serving with an infantry unit in Iraq. He managed to get emergency leave to visit Maria in the hospital. Carlos had always looked up to his older sister, but now he struggled to understand how she had found the strength to continue fighting while severely injured and trapped. Physical therapy began 4 weeks after the attack. Maria worked with Sergeant First Class Michael Thompson, a physical therapist who specialized in helping wounded soldiers return to active duty or transition to civilian life. Her progress was slower than expected, partly due to the severity of her injuries and partly due to her reluctance to fully engage in recovery. The first time Maria stood without assistance, she lasted only 30 seconds before collapsing back into the wheelchair. The pain was manageable, but the psychological challenge of learning to walk again was overwhelming. She had always been physically strong and independent, and the loss of basic mobility was devastating to her sense of self. Military leadership was planning to recommend Maria for the Silver Star, one of the highest decorations for valor in combat. Colonel Hayes explained that her actions clearly met the criteria for exceptional gallantry in action against an enemy force. The recommendation would require detailed testimony from surviving soldiers and analysis of the tactical situation. Sergeant Kim visited Maria 6 weeks after the attack. He was the senior surviving soldier from their base and had been promoted to Sergeant First Class for his leadership during the crisis. Kim described how Maria's radio communications and covering fire had been essential to organizing the counterattack that saved their lives. During his visit, Kim revealed details about the enemy attack that had not been included in official reports. The terrorist cell had sophisticated intelligence about their base, including detailed knowledge of daily routines and security procedures. Someone had provided inside information that made the attack possible. Though the source had not been identified, Maria learned that the enemy had specifically targeted the watchtower to eliminate overwatch capabilities. Intelligence analysts believed the attackers expected to control the compound within 30 minutes of the initial blast. Her survival and continued resistance had extended the battle long enough for survivors to regroup and mount an effective defense. The conversation with Kim helped Maria understand the broader significance of her actions. She had not just survived an attack but had fundamentally altered its outcome through her determination to continue fighting. 14 soldiers were alive because she had refused to give up when trapped under the collapsed watchtower. Physical therapy became more intensive as Maria's injuries began to heal. She graduated from a wheelchair to crutches, then to walking with a cane. Each milestone was painful and exhausting, but Sergeant Thompson pushed her to achieve goals that seemed impossible weeks earlier. The process was rebuilding not just her physical capabilities but her confidence. Maria began working with occupational therapists to develop new skills that would help her transition to civilian life. Her military career was ending, but she needed to find a new purpose and identity. The process was complicated by the fact that she had defined herself as a soldier for her entire adult life. 8 weeks after the attack, Maria received news that changed everything. Intelligence agencies had identified the source of the inside information that made the terrorist attack possible. The investigation had uncovered a broader conspiracy involving multiple military installations, and Maria's testimony would be crucial to bringing the responsible parties to justice. Colonel Hayes explained that the conspiracy involved a network of military contractors who were selling classified information to terrorist organizations. The attack on Maria's base had been a test of their intelligence capabilities, designed to demonstrate their value to potential buyers. The success of the attack would have led to similar operations at bases across the region. Maria's survival and the failure of the attack had disrupted the entire conspiracy. Her actions had not only saved the lives of her fellow soldiers, but had also prevented a series of terrorist attacks that could have killed hundreds of military personnel. The scope of what she had prevented was only now becoming clear. The weight of this revelation was almost overwhelming. Maria realized that her decision to continue fighting while trapped under debris had consequences far beyond what she could have imagined. She had unknowingly become a crucial figure in dismantling a terrorist network that threatened military installations across the region. Recovery took on new meaning as Maria prepared to testify in the investigation that would bring justice for her fallen comrades. Her healing was no longer just about personal recovery, but about ensuring that the soldiers who died in the attack had not sacrificed their lives in vain. 6 months after the attack, Maria sat in a secure courtroom in Virginia, preparing to testify in the conspiracy trial that had captured national attention. Her leg had healed enough for her to walk with only a slight limp, but the mental preparation for reliving that day had been more challenging than any physical therapy session. The lead prosecutor, Major General Rebecca Foster, had spent weeks preparing Maria for her testimony. The case against the military contractors who had sold classified information was strong, but Maria's first-hand account of the attack would demonstrate the deadly consequences of their betrayal. Her words would help ensure justice for the 31 soldiers who had died. Defense attorneys had tried to exclude Maria's testimony, arguing that her injuries had affected her memory and perception of events. Military medical experts testified that her account was reliable and consistent with physical evidence from the attack site. The judge ruled that her testimony was crucial to understanding the full scope of the conspiracy. Maria had studied the faces of the defendants during pretrial hearings. David Kellerman was a former military intelligence officer who had coordinated the sale of classified base layouts to terrorist organizations. Patricia Morrison, a civilian contractor, had provided detailed information about defensive capabilities and daily routines at multiple installations. The third defendant, Colonel William Hayes, had used his position in military logistics to identify vulnerable targets for potential attacks. He was not related to Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, who had supported Maria throughout her recovery. The similarity in names was a painful coincidence that reminded Maria how deeply the conspiracy had penetrated military leadership. When called to testify, Maria walked slowly to the witness stand, aware that her every movement was being observed by the defendants who had made the attack possible. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, thinking of Jake Thompson and the other soldiers who would never have the opportunity to speak for themselves. Major General Foster guided Maria through her testimony with careful questions that established the timeline of events. Maria described the normal security procedures at their base, the arrival of the suspicious convoy, and her growing awareness that something was wrong. Her voice remained steady as she recounted details that she had tried to forget. The defense attorney, Colonel James Wright, attempted to challenge Maria's memory of specific details from the attack. He questioned whether her injuries might have affected her ability to accurately identify enemy positions and count the number of attackers. Maria calmly referred to her written report, compiled immediately after the attack while the details were fresh. Maria's testimony about the 800-meter shot that destroyed the machine gun position was particularly powerful. Technical experts had already testified that such a shot would be extremely difficult under ideal conditions, nearly impossible while injured and trapped under debris. Her success had been a combination of exceptional skill and extraordinary determination. The prosecutor asked Maria to describe the personal cost of the attack on her fellow soldiers. Maria spoke about Jake Thompson, who had been her spotter and friend. She described Corporal Sarah Chen, who had been killed while trying to establish communications with headquarters. Each name represented a life cut short by the Defendant's greed and betrayal. Defense. Attorneys tried to suggest that the attack would have happened, regardless of the classified information provided by their clients. Maria's testimony demolished this argument by explaining how the attackers had known exactly which positions to target and when defensive personnel would be most vulnerable. The precision of the attack proved inside knowledge was essential. The courtroom was silent as Maria described being trapped under the collapsed watchtower, while enemy fighters executed wounded soldiers. Her decision to continue fighting despite her injuries had not been motivated by heroism, but by love for her fellow soldiers and determination to prevent further casualties. Cross-examination lasted 2 days, with defense attorneys attempting to find inconsistencies in Maria's account. They questioned her about sight lines from the collapsed watchtower, the number of rounds she had fired, and her communication with other survivors. Maria answered each question with precision that reflected her military training and natural attention to detail. The defense suggested that Maria had exaggerated her role in the successful defense of the base. Prosecutor Foster countered by calling Sergeant First Class Kim to testify about Maria's crucial contributions. Kim's emotional testimony about how Maria's covering fire had saved his life and the lives of other survivors effectively ended any doubt about her heroic actions. Video. Evidence from base security cameras supported Maria's testimony about the timing and coordination of the attack. The footage showed the suspicious convoy arriving exactly as she had described, followed by the coordinated assault from multiple directions. The defendant's classified information had enabled this level of tactical precision. Expert testimony from military analysts explained how the attack had been designed to test the value of the classified information being sold. Success would have led to similar attacks at other installations, potentially killing hundreds of military personnel. Maria's actions had disrupted this plan and saved countless lives beyond her immediate unit. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with Maria's testimony being the emotional and factual centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Media coverage focused on her remarkable survival and heroism, but Maria was more interested in ensuring that justice was served for her fallen comrades. The attention made her uncomfortable, but she understood its importance. Closing arguments emphasized the betrayal represented by the defendant's actions. They had sworn oaths to protect American military personnel, but had instead sold information that led directly to their deaths. The prosecutor argued that their greed had made them accessories to murder and treason. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against all 3 defendants. Kellerman and Morrison were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Colonel Hayes received the death penalty for treason and multiple counts of accessory to murder. Justice had been served, but it could not bring back the soldiers who had died. After the trial, Maria met privately with families of the soldiers who had been killed in the attack. These conversations were more difficult than her courtroom testimony because they involved personal grief rather than legal proceedings. She shared memories of their loved ones and assured them that their sacrifice had not been forgotten. The Silver Star ceremony was held at the Pentagon 2 weeks after the trial concluded. Maria's parents, brother, and surviving members of her unit attended the ceremony, where she was recognized for exceptional gallantry in action. The medal represented not just her individual heroism, but the courage of all soldiers who risked their lives for their comrades. Standing at attention while the citation was read, Maria thought about the soldiers who deserved recognition but would never receive it. Jake Thompson's parents were in the audience, and she caught Mrs. Thompson's eye during the ceremony. The shared understanding between them was more meaningful than any medal or public recognition. The ceremony concluded Maria's military career, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She had survived impossible circumstances and helped bring justice for her fallen comrades. Now she needed to find a way to honor their memory while building a future that justified her survival when so many others had perished. 2 years after receiving the Silver Star, Maria stood before a classroom of police academy recruits in Phoenix, Arizona. Her new career as a firearms instructor and tactical trainer had given her a way to honor the memory of her fallen comrades while sharing the skills that had saved lives during the attack. Teaching others to protect and serve felt like a natural extension of her military service. The police academy had recruited Maria specifically because of her unique experience and proven ability to perform under extreme pressure. Her story had become part of the curriculum for crisis decision-making and tactical response. Students learned not just shooting techniques but the mental discipline required to remain effective when everything goes wrong. Maria's teaching style emphasized practical application over theoretical knowledge. She created training scenarios based on real situations she had encountered, forcing students to make split-second decisions under stress. Her goal was to prepare them for the moment when their training would mean the difference between life and death for themselves or innocent people. The physical limitations from her injuries had forced Maria to adapt her teaching methods in creative ways. She could not demonstrate all techniques personally, but her analytical approach to marksmanship and tactics proved even more valuable than physical demonstration. Students learned to think through problems rather than simply mimicking movements. Her reputation had spread throughout law enforcement circles, leading to invitations to train special response teams and SWAT units across the country. Maria traveled frequently, sharing advanced techniques for long-range shooting and tactical communication. Each training session was an opportunity to prevent tragedies by better preparing those who serve on the front lines. The Veterans Administration had connected Maria with other wounded warriors who were struggling with their transition to civilian life. She became a mentor and advocate for soldiers dealing with physical and psychological injuries similar to her own. Helping others navigate the challenges of recovery gave her a sense of purpose that complemented her teaching career. Maria established a nonprofit organization called the Watchtower Foundation to provide support for families of soldiers killed in action. The organization offered scholarships for children of fallen soldiers and financial assistance for surviving family members. Jake Thompson's younger sister received the first scholarship, allowing her to attend college and pursue her dreams of becoming a nurse. Speaking engagements at military installations and veteran organizations became a regular part of Maria's schedule. She shared her story not to glorify her actions but to emphasize the importance of never giving up in desperate situations. Her message resonated with audiences who understood the bonds between soldiers and the sacrifices required by military service. The nightmares had gradually diminished, though Maria still experienced occasional flashbacks to that day at the compound. Therapy had helped her process the trauma and survivor's guilt, but the emotional scars would always be part of her. She had learned to view these experiences as reminders of her responsibility to make her survival meaningful. Maria married Detective Carlos Mendoza, whom she met during a police training seminar in Denver. Carlos understood the demands of law enforcement and the psychological challenges of dangerous work. Their relationship was built on mutual respect and shared commitment to protecting others. He supported her work with veterans and often assisted with foundation activities. Their wedding was attended by surviving members of Maria's military unit, including Sergeant First Class Kim, who had been promoted to Sergeant Major. The ceremony was a celebration of life and love, but also a remembrance of those who could not be there. An empty chair at the head table honored Jake Thompson and the other fallen soldiers. The couple settled in Colorado Springs, near several military installations, where Maria could continue her training work. They purchased a home with enough land for a shooting range where Maria could practice and develop new training techniques. The property became a gathering place for veterans and law enforcement officers who needed a supportive community. Maria's expertise was sought by congressional committees studying military base security and intelligence protection. Her testimony helped shape new policies designed to prevent the kind of conspiracy that had made the attack on her base possible. Legislative changes improved background investigations and reduced access to sensitive information by contractor personnel. The Watchtower Foundation expanded its programs to include counseling services for children of military families. Maria understood how military service affected entire families, not just the soldiers themselves. Her foundation worked to ensure that no family would face their challenges alone, especially after losing a loved one in service to their country. On the 5th anniversary of the attack, Maria returned to Afghanistan to visit the memorial erected at the site of her former base. The simple stone monument listed the names of all 31 soldiers who had died in the attack. Standing there with surviving unit members, Maria felt a sense of closure that had eluded her for years. The ceremony at the memorial was attended by military leadership and family members of the fallen soldiers. Maria spoke about the courage and dedication of her comrades, emphasizing that their sacrifice had meaning beyond the circumstances of their deaths. They had lived and served with honor, and their memory continued to inspire others to serve. During her visit to Afghanistan, Maria also spoke with current soldiers stationed in the region. She shared practical advice about staying alert and trusting instincts when something seems wrong. Her message was not about heroism, but about the importance of looking out for fellow soldiers and never abandoning hope in desperate situations. The trip to Afghanistan marked a turning point in Maria's healing process. She finally felt at peace with her survival and confident in her ability to honor her fallen comrades through her continued service. The guilt had not disappeared, but it had transformed into motivation to make every day count for something meaningful. Returning home to Colorado, Maria found renewed energy for her work with the foundation and her teaching responsibilities. She began writing a book about leadership under pressure, drawing lessons from her military experience and her work with law enforcement. The book would become another way to share knowledge that could save lives. 10 years after the attack, Maria received a letter from Ahmad Hassan, a former Afghan interpreter who had worked at her base. Hassan had immigrated to the United States and become a citizen, inspired partly by the courage he had witnessed during the attack. He credited Maria's example with giving him the strength to persevere through his own challenges in building a new life. Maria realized that the impact of that day continued to ripple outward in ways she could never have imagined. Her survival and actions had inspired not just her fellow soldiers, but also civilians who heard her story. The responsibility was both humbling and empowering, confirming her belief that every life saved and every person inspired made her survival worthwhile. As she looked toward the future, Maria saw opportunities to expand her impact through training, mentorship, and advocacy. The girl who had once been the quiet one in Alpha Squad had found her voice and her mission. She would spend the rest of her life ensuring that her survival served a purpose greater than herself, honoring the memory of those who had made the ultimate sacrifice.